Welcome to the Bryden Wood Podcast. Bryden Wood is a global strategy and design consultancy. We are inventive thinkers, designers, engineers, and technical experts. We integrate creativity and deep experience to resolve complex challenges and realize a better world. Find us at brydenwood.com.
Welcome to the Bryden Wood Podcast. We're here to talk about design for climate resilience, and I'm joined by Helen, Hough and Pablo Gugel from our sustainability and building physics team. The subject is very present in the media, and I think people are aware of this subject, maybe not as design for climate resilience, because that's kind of thing the likes of us would talk about, but the general public would talk about protests by people like Insulate Britain, Just Stop Oil, and they would see issues to do with tariffs and grants regarding the Green Deal and various failed initiatives by the government over the past decades. And I guess we'd all wonder actually how we're going to actually solve this problem. And I guess one of the central things is we're going to discuss is if you were to spend £1, in Pablo's case €1, on improving the housing stock, the residential stock of a country, but more particularly the UK, what would you spend it on? Would you spend it centrally? Would you spend it on insulation? Would you spend it on the energy supply? Would you spend it on heating devices, heat pumps? And also, perhaps that's become very key issue is how actually we're going to keep buildings cool, particularly in the UK, because it's quite clear because of the climate change, obviously caused by environmental change, which in turn comes from the poor housing stock to a degree. What are we going to do about that? Are we going to allow cooling in houses, air conditioning? Is that something that's going to become common in Britain, and which is only going to increase the amount of energy usage? So this is one of these circular arguments that we need to get some balance and some understanding of, and we were hoping we might just cast a bit of light on that today. So there's a question for both of you, really. Perhaps Pablo, for yourself first. If you were going to spend £1 on in the climate, you are obviously based in Spain most of the time, Helen, in the UK. Interesting to have the two perspectives here. What would you spend it on primarily and why?
I think in the subject of climate resilience, I think the one aspect that everyone understands, whether you're a specialist or not a specialist in the field, is the weather. The climate considerations, the temperature, how you feel, and overheating is at the moment a massive subject. Everyone is talking about it in the industry. If you look at social media, specialized or in the news, everyone has been talking about the last heat waves. It's a common subject every year. I think over the last few years we've had in the UK really long heat waves, and I think this was the year that got the record temperature in some areas in the south of the UK. So I think at the moment, over the last few years, probably that penny has been spent in insulation mainly, has been always focused in the aspect of reducing energy, mostly related to heating, because in residential buildings everything is about heating and domestic hot water energy. But now the conversation is shifting into cooling. So if I were to spend my penny in cooling, I think probably the aspect is prevention. Try to prevent that cooling or that additional heat coming into the building. As you say, I live in Spain. I'm Spanish, and I know both the two typical languages they have in residential buildings in the UK and in a Mediterranean country like Spain, and there's a big difference. I think there's a cultural difference in that. So one of the things that you don't see mainly in residential buildings is a good shading strategy. Most residential buildings, particularly blocks, they are quite flat. They have large windows because there's a need. I think it's also maybe it's a cultural thing to have good daylight. But in Spain, when you look at the landscape or the architectural languages, there are really generous balconies everywhere from side to side of the facade, but you have awnings or you have shutters. that's the language, because it's something that we've inherited from many years of vernacular architecture. So I think my penny would be in preventing the solar radiation. So the shading would probably be my first intervention. I don't know what you think, Helen.
Yeah, I think it's a really good idea. But I also think there's an element of shifting sort of the culture of how people live, how they feel, whether they feel too hot, too cold. And there's a lot of people that would just whack the heating on as soon as they feel even slightly chilly. And actually, we can do a lot with how we dress and what part of the house you're sort of living in, where you can heat one room rather than a whole house in winter. And in summer, it's about blocking the sun coming in, as you say, but actually it's also about educating people that they will feel warmer in summer. They shouldn't have an expectation that it will be as cool in their house as it is in winter, and they need to dress appropriately. But they also need to learn how to open the windows at the right time to prevent the hot air coming in, how they can use curtains to block some of that without making any, without having to invest in anything new, no new shading, and they'll make a small adjustment, and then maybe the next year they'll make a little bit more.
I think we need to remember that the concept of thermal comfort is it's not really wasn't a thing decades ago, and it's grown and grown and grown in I guess most developed nations, but central heating only really came into to the fore in the 1970s in the UK. I guess it started in the late 50s, but really it was in the 1970s that most homes had central heating, and that's when we all sort of learned to be, thermally. They expected our house to be warm all the way around the house all the time, which is it's an expectation. It's an expectation that's grown, and in hot climates, in developed countries, for example in the USA, people might even expect that of cooling in the summer. So they expect their house to be entirely cool throughout. And one of the questions is, can we really solve all these problems with just with technology? Can we really put in more systems into our houses, more insulation into our houses, and spend this money for reducing returns? Because at some point we've just got to realise that actually we are unable to control our environment as closely as we may have in the past if we're going to reduce the energy usage of buildings. That's the question, really, I suppose, as well as a statement. That's. I think some people think it's a failure to be unable to overcome those things, but I think in some ways society will have to learn to live with slightly lower thermal comfort indices, as we call it.
I think one aspect of it is because thermal comfort is subjective.
Yeah.
And it's not just the thermal comfort that is subjective, is what people like, the way that people like to deal with thermal comfort. Some people, for example, are happy in an air-conditioned environment. For example, I hate air conditioning. It makes me feel sick. Some people would like to have a fan. Some people would like to have the windows open. So because each individual has a different way to deal with it. What you need to provide is different measures, like an array of opportunities for people to choose. So, and those opportunities, they are shading again, which can have different forms. Natural ventilation is another opportunity. The other one is air movement that you can get through a fan, or in the last resource, ideally, air conditioning. So if you have all those tools for you, at least you can choose the one that you like and get more psychologically comfortable as well.
I mean, this must be possible because, of course, still in Scotland, air conditioning is pretty well non-existent in domestic properties, at least. Because peak temperatures in cities like Edinburgh, which is obviously in the south of the country, are still only 27, 28 degrees typically in the summer. I think it's gone over 30 degrees once, but it's pretty uncommon compared to the kind of temperatures we're getting in southeast of England. So it's really a line across the country actually because of the range of the it's quite a temperature range actually across the UK, and it's a question of moving that line effectively up. Can we contain the requirement for air conditioning only to the extreme southeast of Britain and not let it grow, this perception for the need for it grow across the whole country by using things like shading and and heat rejection measures on the outside of buildings or on the glazing of buildings to try and prevent heat build-up in the first place, or increase natural ventilation, because that's got to be good for the country as a whole.
I think you totally can, but I also think you need to change the perception of what people expect.
Yeah.
But going back to the idea of different people like different measures, even within a family, they're like different things, and even male, female, you have different perceptions of hot and cold. So
is this a public education thing?
I think there is an element of
Do we
public
have to
education, an
educate the
element of
public?
culture. Yeah, educate people, but there's a culture. You're never going to completely change the culture. You can't swing it so that we live really similar to Mediterranean sort of architectural feel. That's never going to happen. But actually, if we can take some of the elements,
It's a very interesting,
to help us.
unfashionable idea, that, because
Yes.
yeah, I like unfashionable ideas, because I'm probably the only one old enough here to remember public information films. So we used to have public information films on the TV that would instruct you to do various things about health and safety and so on. A thing that's completely disappeared. I think it's completely disappeared. And I think most people would find it laughable now, the idea that a government could sort of educate the population through the use of television. Especially, there's so few people actually watching the television, only streaming things these days. But it was a form of centralized control that did have an effect. And it could actually, and it's a bit like that now. We like to tell the public, actually, this is the way to deal with your house in the summer. This is some of the measures you could do to your house to prevent these problems in the first place, to some degree. Even if it's a small degree, it's still quite effective, because that's a zero expenditure thing, apart from the announcement itself.
But you're seeing it in the news already. That you're
Yes,
seeing,
well,
you go on your news app, and there's now, this is what you can do to help your house.
in this period of influencers, what we need is climate influencers who positively influence for people's thermal comfort, and actually suggest, just like we have fitness tips on almost a minute by minute basis coming through news feeds and so on. We should actually perhaps have a bit more of a debate regarding how to generate better conditions in buildings for people.
But that's really important. I think that can be really useful, because we think that the most obvious things are known by most of the people, and that may not be true. So, for example, if you ask people in the UK if they should open the windows during the day or during the night, they might say, well, it's hot, I'm going to open the window. And that's completely wrong. So in a heat wave, when you have 30 degrees outside or 35 degrees, don't open the window. You need to keep your house cool. So the only way to deal with it, the first layer of defense, is close the windows in the day, ventilate during the night. In my grandfather's house when I was a kid, they lived in an old house in a region of Spain that reaches 40 degrees every single summer. So one of the things they would do is close the windows. I mean, my grandfather, if he would see you opening the window, he would go after you, like, open the window. So not only that, they would have shutters. They would close everything, so the house would be pitch black during the whole day, and then only in the evening you would open the windows and you would ventilate the house. That's the only way to deal with it. This is really basic.
Well, in some respects, that there's people in the UK who think, oh, that sounds awful. We're going to black out the house during the day, because we're only talking about in the UK potentially having to do that for a few days a year. So this is a really small concession, and those are days when it's very bright anyway, and you're probably going to be outside for a period of the day. So it isn't such a radical proposition as it might sound when you first say it. But again, typical for the climate you're talking about. So there's definitely some learning. Can I sort of move this around a bit from the cultural aspect, because clearly there are cultural differences. Clearly there are things that people in the UK can learn from different cultures. Tolerance is one of them. Thermal tolerance, I think, in the first place. But also just tips on making their houses cooler. But one of the questions is, should we look a bit more centrally to these things? Because I have to say, we've been talking a lot about keeping houses cool, but actually we know that most of the energy is expended, a much higher percentage of the energy, even if cooling exists in houses, much higher use of energy is heating of houses in the winter. So obviously we want to insulate for that. And of course, the very easy insulation of houses has long since been done, which is not maybe effectively everywhere, but which is the use of loose layer loft insulation, initiative that I think came in the 70s again, ran through the 80s, and pretty well all houses have loft insulation, and that was very simple to put in because it didn't change it didn't change any of the functional aspects of your house at all. Unlike insulating the walls of your house, which has to be applied to the, well, if it's not cavity fill insulation, which had its own problems, if people remember this in history because of some of the water ingress issues that came from cavity fill insulation. But if it's not cavity fill insulation, then it's applied to the inside wall of the house or to the outside face of a house, which has, it's a myriad of problems that come from doing that. And also, maybe you could talk to the fact that this is really what we're talking about here is modifications to existing building stock, because one of the things we see is lots of initiatives and lots of regulations about new buildings, but the problem is that's still a very small percentage of the overall housing stock, and therefore if we're really to have any effect on this in the short term, then, or even the medium term for that matter, then we have to consider mainly the existing housing stock. So yes, I think it's difficult for us to any of three of us here to argue with some of the moves towards higher insulation levels in new buildings, although that does create its own overheating problems, and you know, and the move, for example, to heat pumps away from gas boilers. These are all very sensible moves in many respects, and the inclusion of, for example, MVHR heat recovery systems in houses, all great. But what about the existing housing stock? How do you best go about upgrading the insulation levels of existing buildings? Is it tending to the glazing? Is it intending to the walls? Is it intending to the roof? You can't really do much about slab in existing buildings. So installation of MVHR to improve the control of air leakage from a building. What do we think the best measures? If you spend £1 again, what would you get the greatest benefit from?
Well, I think you need to insulate the walls. I think a lot of houses have already gone from the single glazing to the double glazing. Yes, that is obviously a great thing, but there's not a lot of houses have already done that measure. That's a bit easier. Insulating internally is great from an architectural perspective. When you walk down the street, your house still looks the same, but installing insulation internally can cause condensation, so lots of ventilation needed. Do you want to do that in winter when you're bringing in the really cold air? That's going to cause other issues with people feeling too cold. So then you think, well, should we be doing that? Should we be installing our insulation externally where it's easier to control that condensation? Both have issues, don't they, in terms of installation? How do you go about it? How much chaos are you causing to your house, your neighbours? The scaffold you might need to put up, the cost of it. But at the end of the day, you'd end up with lower heating bills. And that's an ongoing year-on-year saving that you're going to get as that person living in that.
I guess the real problem is that some of the capital cost of some of these installations are in the tens of thousands.
Yeah.
Very complex in certain instances, because obviously if you put insulation on the inside of your walls, it's interrupted by floors and internal walls and partitions. Those are potential thermal breaks. There are in situ condensation concerns. There is all the concerns about workmanship and getting reliable contractors to do this work in the first place. You know, there's a myriad of problems with this. Would this money better be spent in some way? For example, would it be better spent on decarbonising the energy supply in the first place? So effectively, just a question is, you know, use more energy but generate that energy in zero carbon, so from solar panels or from additional wind generation or nuclear power potentially, obviously done as a mix to get that kind of blended grid that we all need to because of clearly the cycle of power from solar and wind needs to be balanced with nuclear and so on. But whatever, that's investing in the central energy infrastructure. And although it's very expensive, I mean, famously expensive infrastructure spending, we're talking about millions of properties. And we're talking about upgrading millions of properties in Britain. What is the best use of that money? Is it in upgrading those properties, or is it in fact in diverting some of that money at least to the improvement of central energy infrastructure, decarbonisation.
But I think that the problem of that approach is that we need to think about the operational cost of this bill. So if you decarbonize the grid, and that means that the way to tackle these problems is to have an electric boiler, an air conditioner that is electric, or a heat pump. If you have a really inefficient envelope, you put your heat pump, and the energy bills would go over the roof. That's something that so many people are talking about heat pumps, and I've heard the stories of people who invest in a heat pump without having addressed the envelope before. And then it's so expensive that it becomes a different problem. And I think it's particularly a problem because now, there's a lot of people who live in energy poverty who cannot pay their bills. So I think the first approach, at least in my perspective, would be to try to reduce the bills, which means try not to use the energy. I think the problem to that is what you were saying before, yes, in any way, you always need to invest some money before. There's a capital cost associated to that. Who can spend £20,000, £10,000 in upgrading the envelope by having insulation or by changing the windows? Is a problem. Is the government going to pay for that? Are we expecting people to go to the bank and borrow some £20,000? How do we solve that? But the problem is that the other problem is that it's a problem of perspective. I don't think we need to look at a much bigger issue. It's not about trying to reduce the energy bills a little bit. It's the government. They have committed to be net zero by 2050. You're not going to be net zero by 2050 by just adding insulation or just by replacing the windows. You need to be much more ambitious. So the LETI organism, they developed this publication on refurbishing, and they said that the only way to make that all the existing residential building to become net zero is to raise it to the standard of passive house. Passive house, for people who don't know what it is a very ambitious, energy efficient scheme that looks into insulation, air tightness, windows, heat recovery, basically the best of the best at every level. That's the only way to be net zero by 2050. So the level of the ambitious is huge.
I mean, it's a sort of brings it into sharp perspective because, I mean, for people that don't know, the idea of passive house being achieved in 5%, 10% of the UK housing stock is almost hard. Very hard to imagine or believe. You have to have incredibly low change rates. You have to have an MVHR system ready to get heat recovery and necessary ventilation. You need very insulation that would be amazing to most people. The kind of 300 millimeter thick insulation to walls and roofs and so on. It's something that's going to be extremely difficult to. I mean, I'm actually going to pose another question, which is slightly more radical, a societal question, which is, you know, the density of people per cubic meter of housing is an interesting concept, which I could put more simply for people as house blocking. So old people, you end up with two people living in a large house for, 3, 4, 5 bedrooms. Often they've had a family and the family have moved out, as they do, and they retain the building and so on. And actually what we actually have is we do. If you looked at the actual fundamental efficiency, particularly in the UK, I suspect culturally this is potentially a bigger problem in the UK than it is in other countries. I won't go into why I suspect that at the moment, but I do. And you have sometimes two people living in a house with maybe 8, 9, 10 rooms, 11 rooms, and sometimes quite big with it. And clearly that's highly inefficient. Fundamentally, across the whole country, that's a highly inefficient way of keeping people in a comfortable internal environment. What you would do is you give people a much more even and reasonable. Now, it all sounds like something you couldn't possibly control, but I think there's been a lot of talk. This is another subject that's come up in the press a lot. There's been a lot of talk about older people relinquishing their houses to the housing market because of the pressure on housing. And otherwise, if we don't get that to happen more frequently, where people start to move into the appropriate size properties, then we will just keep needing to build new properties. And we've all seen in the news constantly the drive for extra housing. Now the question is it that we've got a terrible housing shortage in Britain, or is it that we actually don't deploy our housing relative to the population numbers as effectively as we can? Now, how on earth you exactly manipulate that, I don't know, but it is a fundamental thing you can't completely ignore. Any thoughts on that? Social intervention, radical social intervention, but it's a fact that in the UK
Yeah.
it's just not well distributed.
And it's also the typology in general. I think in the UK, more people like living in houses. In other countries, you would see
Yeah.
many more blocks of houses, and people
Sure.
don't have any
We're getting
expectations.
used to it in the major cities in Britain these days. There are a lot more
It's-
different
Yeah.
apartments,
say-
rise apartment blocks, but you're absolutely right.
And flats are much more energy efficient
Yeah.
than houses. And so I think the problem with the UK comes from many different angles. Is the climate is changing, the typology is not the right one, the density is not the right one. And
The UK is the perfect storm.
It's the perfect storm.
It all needs to be sustained.
Yeah, well, that's
Yeah,
another
well,
way of
No, but I mean, obviously, that's why one of the things is that it's sometimes difficult actually for the UK population to see the absurdity of their housing stock without getting an external perspective on it. Which yours is a Spanish perspective today, but there are other perspectives. I'm sure some Icelandic perspectives or whatever the subject might be interesting. But there is something of a perfect storm about the UK housing stock. It's inefficient in it's got a multi dimensions of inefficiency coming together to create a problem that I think it can't be intractable, but we have to be imaginative about how we solve.
I guess you encourage downsizing, which is effectively what we're saying.
Mm.
But actually, that house has just got the next family moving into it. That house is still the same building fabric that it was with the previous family. Still got the same issues around heating, keeping it cool in summer.
It does prevent the building of more houses, albeit those houses would be under new regulations.
But you still got
you still have the upgrading
thing stock to retrofit.
You still have the upgrading issue. But actually, one of the points there is, I mean, the problem is that the new housing stock is just so much more efficient than the existing housing stock. It almost becomes an irrelevancy. It's like not even if the regulations. I have a problem with the what you might call the inflation in regulations, because it's a bit like, because the government, it's a lever they can pull readily. They can change the standard of the building regulations, and I mean, both you guys this is your business, so you're going to sort of, generally speaking, condone this move towards passive house standards. I don't want to detract from that, but I want to ask the question: should we really be? Because there's some significant increases in costs by implementing new regulations that people have to bear. That means there gets potentially a lower quantity of new housing because people simply can't afford it. The economics of development don't work if you put too many regulations in place that increase the costs by significant percentage points. Then the people won't develop, and therefore and we're seeing that at the moment. There isn't actually, there's some concerns that the house building boom that we perceive we require, notwithstanding the comments we made earlier about better fitting the population to the housing stock. Well, notwithstanding that, I don't know that we can really, if we can really afford to do this. Perhaps actually we shouldn't be inflating regulations as quickly as we are, and we should be looking to the retrofitting of the 80%, 90% of the housing stock, which is was built under regulations that frankly didn't consider climate change as a big issue.
I think the focus should be clearly, if you want to tackle the problem at the biggest scale, it should be refurbishment, because of what we said before, is the biggest proportion of the residential stock.
So how do we finance that? I mean,
how do you motivate people?
How do we? Well, that's what I mean. Really. How do we motivate people? How do we make that happen? What levers would you imagine anybody, government, what would be the things that incentivize people to do that? I'm begging that question. Really, I agree with you, but I've no idea how to stimulate.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because the government's already tried things like the Green Deal, where you can have a grant and you'll pay it back via your lower bills, but it didn't work. Not many people took it up. Not many people were trained as installers under that scheme, and it kind of fell a bit flat. So,
But we see financial incentivization, for example, for electric cars.
Mm.
Should we be incentivizing electric cars over incentivizing? I mean, there are millions of ways you could incentivize decarbonisation, but perhaps actually it's a neglect. Refurbishment and upgrading of buildings is perhaps a neglected one. It's not very exciting. It's not exciting for a population compared to, for example, encouraging people to adopt electric cars.
but there is incentives to get rid of your gas boiler and replace it with a heat pump. And you can only do that if you've done certain upgrades to your house already, in terms of maybe insulating or the glazing,
Well,
that kind of thing, which is good.
That's a very good point.
But actually, not everyone wants a heat pump right now. But some people would actually like to keep their boiler because it's working, it's good. But they'd like the incentive for those fabric upgrades, and that's not around.
But you make a very good point, which is you don't really want, in an awful lot of housing stock, you don't want to put a heat pump in with the fabric performance of a current building.
No.
Because it doesn't work very well. Because we all know that. So a heat pump, if it's going to be efficient, isn't raising the temperature of the water beyond about 40, 50 degrees. Not the 70, 80 degrees that you would have got out of your boiler in the first place. So all of your radiant surface, all your radiators aren't big enough. So if you're going to overcome that, you've either got to change those, or you've got to insulate in the first place. So you just don't need as much heat in the room. So you can run your radiators at these reduced temperatures, for example. So this is a big problem in the sense that introduction of heat pumps is only going to apply to a certain percentage of the housing stock. Quite frankly, the rest of the housing stock is going to be uncomfortable with a heat pump because it's going to not be able to deliver the same levels of heating into the home.
I think the analogy you made with the cars is really good, because there's a reason why people buy electric cars. And I think a small percentage of the reason will be people who are committed to sustainability or climate change. I think most of the users of an electric car will be just because they need to go to the city center, and they want an electric car that enables them to go to the city center in those areas where there are restrictions, like in London, for example. So in the UK, in residential buildings, if you want to do the same thing, try to motivate people to go electric or to go to better systems or insulate their house because they need to save the planet. Probably a really tiny percentage of people would do it because of that reason. So the only way to do it is by restricting. And how do you restrict? Saying by the end of the life cycle of your boiler, you don't have a choice. You have to go electric. That's one way of doing it. Similar like with the cars, you don't have a choice. If you want to use your car in the city center, it has to be electric.
Well, in that case, I'll go back to the concept of public information films, which I can't see returning. But people need to realise that actually, if this is the case, and we are actually going to just phase out, we will be phasing out gas heating, then they need to start preparing soon. Because it's not one of those things they'll get an almighty shock if they actually have to change the heat pump and their house is completely inadequate for it, because they will not only need to upgrade their house, but they'll have to install the heat pump simultaneously. So that'll be a very big part. It'd be better if there was an upgrading the house in the meantime, which would reduce their bills.
Yeah.
And then it would make it suitable with the introduction of the heat pump at the point when the sale of gas boilers becomes no longer illegal, effectively. So this is a thing that that's to us that is fairly simple and fairly obvious. But is it simple and obvious to the population that their house is effectively not fit for purpose? Because when it becomes a house that's unheatable from natural gas, what will they do? I think that's a piece of information that's really not coming across, and I think we go back to one of these things: is how is this going to be able to? How do we get this quite fairly complex conversation about the best thing to do to your property to improve its performance, which is which is quite complex because it's variable depending on the property, but in the way it's the apartment. This is heating and stopping overheating. I won't call it cooling, but stopping overheating. It varies. It varies. Your most efficient route to an improved performing property is, slightly different depending on where it is, what it is, whether it's a house, whether it's a flat, and so on. And I just don't know how people are going to. There needs to be more access to more knowledge and more information about the subject. People need to be helped with this. I mean, one of the things is that maybe there needs to be schemes where people are given slightly more targeted, more specific information about how to upgrade their house, rather than these very generalist things that come out by some method. Maybe there's an organisation set up by the government that gives people better understanding of cost-effective measures they can take on their property.
There's one angle that we didn't touch, that is the cultural perspective of developers. And I think this is related to new construction. I know
Yep.
this is smaller in proportion to the impact, but I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding, because there's a perception that building regulations cause overheating in new construction, and it is and it isn't. So the addition of insulation reduces the heat loss reduces the heat loss and the heat gain through the walls. But what causes the overheating is, again, the lack of solar protection. But this types up with other levels of complexity. One of them is safety. That seems to be a problem for many developers. And developers at the moment do not want to have openable windows because they don't want people falling. I mean, they don't want to have the accident in the reputation, and that's causing lots of restrictions in the design of residential buildings. That, added to the cultural thing of not having different insulation, is making the problem of overheating. Everyone's saying, it's the building regulations that is causing overheating. No, it's not. It's not the insulation part of the building regulations. It's the everything related to that. Is the not being able to naturally ventilate, not being able to put external shelling in buildings. All of that combined is causing the problem. And I think that's something that requires a bit of thinking at the same time.
So one of the things I guess I feel we should come to some sort of not a conclusion, but at least some unified thoughts on, is how much do we think this the improvement of the housing stock, as we said in the title, the climate resilience of the housing stock, how much do we think this is going to be imposed upon people, and how much do we think people are going to be, is this going to be self-generated? And if it's going to be self-generated, how is I mean, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen easily. So do we have to encourage an increased level of thought and consideration of this by the general public? I mean, what is the mechanism? Is it centralized government, or is it devolved? Do we grow it from the desire of the general population to lower their bills, improve their thermal comfort, save the planet? Or is it something that we've, quite frankly, just don't have the time, and we have to impose from on high by taking more draconian measures like eliminating certain traditional heating types and so on, and legislating? What do we think about that?
I think there's a very small proportion of people that would do it all off their own back.
Well,
So you're for
So-
central legislation.
I don't necessarily think that's the way that it should go, but I think
it's the only way.
people aren't motivated enough.
How draconian should
Absolutely draconian. And I'm only saying this because the scale of the problem is way bigger
Massive.
than just talking about overheating and thermal comfort. It's what I said before about the 2050 commitment to net zero. That commitment is only achievable if you do something really ambitious. So if the government, for example, is talking at the moment, I think there was recent news about the bringing nuclear back, or building nuclear power, which is an amazing investment for any government. So that's the level of investment that they need to bring or consider if they really want to go for 2050 net zero. People is not going to be investing enough money individually in all the houses to be able to meet that target. So I think it's the government who needs to come with an agenda. I don't know. Sometimes it feels like a bit like, well, it's the government's problem. They deal with it. But realistically, who can resolve the problem? We were talking about a combination of factors in the UK. Is the climate, is the culture.
We talk about perfect storm.
Is the perfect storm. That perfect storm, you need a not a perfect solution, but
Perfect solution.
a really ambitious strategy to it.
So I mean, I often think at the moment there's been a sort of, I don't know, there's been an inflation in people's expectations of what a government can do for them.
Well, that's
and quite frankly, I just don't think this is something where governmental central control is going to do it. And I think there just needs to be a growth in public perception of how much responsibility each individual takes for this problem. People just not understanding the trade-off. So, for example, if I pose the trade-off of if you improved the quality of your housing stock, then it would justify your ability to still fly on holiday for a longer period of time. People don't make that trade-off between the energy use and the carbon impact of flight, for example, transportation versus their house. They just don't understand the proportionality of those things, and therefore they're not asked to be responsible. They're not given the tools to be climate responsible. That's one of the things that I would say is that, and if they were, they'd realise their housing stock was one of the significant. It's one of the largest contributors to climate change, and that's something that they actually, as a population, could do something about.
I think there's a lot of information out there explaining what you need to do or what is your responsibility about climate change, but taking responsibility means a change in your lifestyle and a change that affects your pockets. So you need to be.
But the problem with individual responsibility is that it's always someone else's, then, isn't it? It's always someone else's responsibility.
Yeah.
Which is really plays to your thing, Helen, of saying it's got to be done at a government central level to quite a high degree, and I'm struggling to disagree with that. We'd all kind of like that not to be the case. I think that's why would we ever want to be to people to put draconian measures that force the population? Everybody wants to relatively be a libertarian, but it's hard to see given the pace. It's the speed. For me, it's the speed. If this was something that we knew was an issue, and we knew we had centuries to solve, then a gentle progression towards the improvement of housing stock will be one thing. But this is something we have to transform within a decade, within 2 decades, and that's a phenomenal amount of effort, and will not happen just by changing public perception.
I think it's the speed, but it's also that capital cost. It's not money that people have got sat around in their bank ready to spend on their house.
Almost nobody.
Well, indeed.
Makes
Okay.
a huge difference to people.
Well, the question therefore is how it's knowing which measures to take, which by reduction in your heating bills is, in other words, payback period. So basically, if things have short payback periods, 5 years. Loft insulation, as we said earlier, easiest one. Payback period was a year or something like that, because you got a loose layer of loft insulation. You could put it in yourself. It didn't cost very much. It came from a local DIY store, and it saved quite a bit of energy because it was in the right place in the building. Therefore, it paid itself back in no time flat. Okay, that was the easy wins have gone. But what is the next one? And what is the next one? And the next one? And how do people get the information? This is where you say there's a lot of information out there, Pablo, but crafting it to your own specific property or problem is another matter. So saying my house would benefit better from reducing the air leakage rate, for example, because a particular type of window and glazing, which is like a sash window, for example, which is particularly bad from a leakage point of view, that might be better benefit than insulating the walls initially. But the next thing would be insulating the walls, and then it would be insulating something else, and so on. And I do it with, how much insulation would I put? 50 millimeters of insulation? Would I put 200 millimeters of insulation? Would I use a non-combustible insulation? Could I use a combustible insulation? Not, for obvious reasons, not a great idea, but they still exist for use in certain locations. What do people, how do people get that? Even if they wanted to do it, how are we going to give them the tools to increase their understanding and also protect them against things like, for example, sprayed insulation in roofs, which we've just seen again in the news? These are things that are constantly in the news. They caused people to be able to not get mortgage on houses and completely devalue properties. This is the UK again. I don't think this existed in Spain, and that was one of the a number of different commercial initiatives, which were quite frankly poorly conceived or technically inadequate. And again, the government needs to be somebody needs to be advising the government and giving a quality of central information that causes those things not to happen in the future. Any more thoughts on this pretty? I mean, we can't do nothing. And to be honest, as we said earlier, the UK has one. I mean, I'm sure there are other nations, but UK does have a bigger problem than many other countries. It has a housing stock that's poor. It has a poor density of population within that housing stock. It's got building types that aren't naturally efficient in the first place, and it has a climate which has the audacity to be cold and hot now.
Mm-hmm.
It was only cold once, now it's cold and hot, and it's wet.
Yeah.
And we won't even get onto the subjects of flooding and of water scarcity in certain regions. Those are other subjects, interrelated subjects that create a great deal of problems for people and are very much, again, in the media. Maybe we'll talk about them some other time. But so we're for decisive government action. Yes.
An individual responsibility.
An increase in individual responsibility, which we generate by a method we haven't quite determined. I think for me, one of the things that's come out of this is actually, I think that knowledge, giving people knowledge that they don't have. I think there's a lot of knowledge people don't have. They don't have the knowledge about quite how bad things are. They don't have the knowledge about how they need to do a whole series of steps in order to improve the house. It's like not just one thing. People are always looking for the panacea. They're always looking for, I put a heat pump in and everything's great, but it's not. It's a suite of things they need to do across their property, and I think people's understanding and education needs to be raised quite dramatically. And I think in doing so, I think that'll encourage. I think that will encourage personal responsibility to some degree, because greater understanding always increases people's. It gets them thinking. And then when they get them thinking, it tends to increase their personal responsibility.
And I think there's another responsibility. There is a responsibility of companies like us we have the information, right? So
what did you tell them, Pablo?
Yeah, so I mean,
hopefully Spain to tell us.
This podcast can clear some ideas. So
I listen. I think the cultural perspectives are really useful.
Yeah,
and I think there are definitely things to do with the overheating that we are not mimicking from the continent that we should be, and actually somewhat easier to implement than the thermal insulation.
That's free.
So you shouldn't forget the small steps; they're still important.
Yeah, it's a debate. No single person knows the answer to this question, but and quite frankly, we didn't touch on all of the areas this subject deserves. But I think for today, that's about as many as far as we can go in terms of increasing increasing public awareness, at least, of what they should do.